there's never been a better time for the majority of people to be alive. And the future, although we're vulnerable and terrible things can always happen to us, it's hard to make a case that the future doesn't look comparatively positive. We're becoming extremely technologically sophisticated, and the world is changing at an incredibly rapid rate, and the only way we're going to be able to manage that in a positive way is if each of us, or as many of us as possible, are capable of making wise and careful and truthful decisions. And if we do that, then maybe things can continue to improve. Do you guys have any faith in the idea that there is actually measurable inflation? Because is it reasonable? I don't understand inflation. There's a basket of goods and services that are calculated. The price of them is calculated every year. But what's in that basket of goods and services seems to me to be a relatively arbitrary choice. I mean, what makes you think that there has in fact been objectively reliable inflation, say, over the last 30 years, given, for example, that many manufactured goods and so forth have got dramatically cheaper? Now, I know housing in many places has skyrocketed to a tremendous degree, but do you really feel that the currency has become corrupted, and that you can, and what do you rely on to make that case? What data do you rely on?
I could jump in here, I think. I would say unquestionably, debasement of the currency, it is an arbitrary harvesting of the economic surplus a productive free market economy is creating. So as an economy gets more efficient, it generates more wealth that's passed back into to market actors in the form of declining prices. So we're getting smarter at making chairs, smarter at providing services, electronics, all these things. But by printing money, you're basically stealing claims on that economic surplus and doling it out arbitrarily. So we could say another way to think about this is that the free market itself, as you've described, Jordan, it's a distributed computing system. So we all have our 120 bits per second conscious attention span. You multiply that out by 8 billion market participants. That is the cognitive power of the free market. Right.
I want to emphasize that because it's such an important point, and it could easily be skipped over, because there are people who admire the ideas of central planning and think, well, maybe there's 40 people doing your central planning, and so maybe they're the smartest people in the world and they're doing your central planning, but they have to calculate on the fly a virtually infinite amount of information if they don't have free market prices at their disposal. They have to calculate what metal is worth, what nails are worth, what labor is worth, what rubber is worth, what cleanup is worth, what nursing is worth, et cetera, and they have to do all those comparisons, and they have to do those computations, and there's actually no way even technically of doing that, and the alternative is to distribute that calculation across a virtually infinite number of actors, or actors in the billions at least, and let every single person act as a computational device and sum all that, and that's what the free market does. It's not even in principle replaceable by a logical cognitive mechanism. I can't see how it is.
That's exactly right. It's not even possible that a centralized bureaucracy, a centralized computing model can compete with a distributed computing model of the free market. We could actually, in fact, say that the free market is a pure economic democracy. People are voting by buying and selling, and whatever price is generated on any given asset, that's effectively the truth of what it trades at. Any intervention on that, any regulation, any pricing czar as they had in the USSR, you move along that spectrum towards an economic tyranny, where we have now the arbitrary wishes of a few overriding what the free market democracy is selecting.
My understanding was that the 2008 crisis was fundamentally produced by a technological revolution. And the technological revolution was something like the realization that you could take investments of a certain risk level, mortgages, let's say, substandard mortgages, and by bundling them together in huge tranches and huge groups, you could quantify the risk, and as a consequence of quantifying the risk, you could make the group of investments more valuable than they would be as the sum of the individual investments, which I thought was a brilliant innovation. And so now these companies, banks, traded these huge tranches of subprime mortgages because they could quantify the risk, and that means that could be accounted for financially, and so the risk was ameliorated. And the flaw was Well, no one realized that doing so en masse would increase the probability that housing prices would become correlated across time, across huge geographical regions, for example, across the entire United States. And so the housing market could collapse all at once. But you could make the case that that was actually a flaw in the free market computing prowess, because a technological innovation came along, warped the entire system, and then what had to happen was the political system had to rescue it. And so I watched that and I thought, well, was the political system embedded in the economic system, which is, I think, the argument you guys are fundamentally making, or is the economic system embedded in the political system? And what's wrong with my analysis of what happened in 2008? Wasn't it the case that the market was rescued by the political actors? Is that incorrect?
Peterson is putting out the fire. Sorry, go ahead, Rob.
Yeah. No, I could start, and you guys feel free to jump in. So I would first encourage you to look into what's called the Eurodollar system, which is essentially this. We control the pyramid scheme in the U.S., the domestic dollar supply, but there's this offshore derivative system where everyone's trying to peg the dollars that the central bank doesn't control. That's actually been considered to be at the root of the 2008 crisis, and then this was kind of a cover story. But if we just get back to error, so we could say risk is error, right? So there was this embedded risk that we thought we had calculated and contained. But what was actually happening is, because we have centrally planned money, it's pushing hidden risk into the economy, right? Because the free market distributed intelligence being defined as error correction, it's mitigated by the central planning of money. So these hidden risks accumulate, and that's why we've had increased volatility since 1971. We have these huge economic booms, we print a bunch of money, inflation runs hot, but so do assets. Everyone thinks they're doing really well. And then we have these catastrophic retracements back to economic reality. And actually,
that's because incremental reaction to risk is not being implemented. That's what you'd expect, right?
We're diverging perceptions from reality, effectively. So even the correction in March 2020, that was the sharpest liquidity collapse in the history of markets. It was faster than 1929. So we would expect, as more fiat currency, which is artificial liquidity, is pumped into the system, it's further distorting this economic perceptual faculty and creates even more volatile boom and bust. This is the Austrian business cycle theory in a nutshell. And the only way to resolve this is to let the free market clear errors. That's what it does. That's what consciousness does too, by the way. So you can think of the free market as our interconnected consciousnesses mediated by the price signal. When you disturb the price signal, our consciousnesses become divided and we have increased errors and blow-ups.
Well, that's why I suggest to people that they don't engage in deception, because they distort the value signals and they warp their own consciousness. It's a very dangerous thing to do.
That's right.
Because you only use deception
That's exactly what money does. That's exactly what fiat money does.
Fiat currency is a living lie. That's it in a nutshell.
Okay, so let's talk practically for a bit. So, and then we'll return to the central discussion. I mean, Elon Musk has recently objected to Bitcoin on the basis of, and maybe is this a flaw? Bitcoin becomes more and more expensive to produce as we proceed through time. And the consequence of that is that we do, in fact, use up more energy, or at least that's in one form, which is computational energy. Maybe we gain that back in, efficiencies within the market itself. You could argue that. But what do you think about Musk's recent decision with regard to Bitcoin?
I would love to jump in on that, because I have written about that extensively. And I think what you said is exactly right, that Bitcoin is a map of value, so to speak. And what's so interesting